on the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
Greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and welcome to the first edition of Second Opinion. Essentially, the first 46 episodes of my review series are trash. Absolutely irredeemable. Do not watch under any circumstances. Also a couple of videos after that, and while you're at it, chuck in the entire first 2 seasons of the Legendary Marathon. I guess it's to be expected. As you progress over the years in your craft, the newer stuff is always going to be better than the old shit. But that doesn't stop people going back through the catalogue and torturing themselves. So, I have a solution. Remake them! I'm not going to remake every single video. Some figures don't fit with the channel, and others I just don't have anymore. But I think it's a good idea to go back and re-examine some of these older figures in a more recent context. So, 2014 was a rather special year for Transformers, particularly in the bootleg scene. Knockoffs had always existed parallel to the franchise, but that was the year that they really took off. Hasbro was in a really tight spot. Budget cuts were forcing them to downsize and simplify their figures to a massive extent. It's the primary reason why Aaron Archer left, which led to John Warden taking his place. Movie toy lines were hit hardest by this. The Mark Wahlberg films delivered some of the worst received toy lines in recent memory. Then there was the fact that Age of Extinction, the film that came out that year, was set in China. Transformers had always been popular there, but it's clear that this choice allowed the film to make a massive connection with such an audience. It's most likely that reason that led to 5 different third-party Night Optimus Primes, yet not a single third-party original trilogy version. Look, China, I know you loved Age of Extinction, but can you please just give us an original trilogy one? No, not like that! These two factors came together in a flash of light and burst open the doors for the bootleg market. Because of this, high-quality knockoffs are more prevalent than ever, even with the recent Weijang shutdown. So I thought I'd take a trip down memory lane and bring you back to a time when such bootlegs were in their infancy, as was the state of my adult collecting journey. These days, we're pretty spoiled for choice when it comes to flat-nosed cab primes. They all vary in quality, jumping from awesome to pretty neat to kinda underwhelming to why wasn't the robot mode like this? Hell, at the time of writing mere days ago, we had yet another announced, although it does make me wonder how it ends up looking worse than Freedom Leader, who was notorious for how compromised his truck mode was. However, back in the first half of the 2010s, those options weren't as common. Generations has long since moved on from the classics version, opting instead to do whatever the the designers felt like on any given day. Meanwhile, the Movieverse designers chugged along for the most part, and even after this moment in the film, the design took a nosedive. Seriously, what even is this? Who thought this design was okay? Understanding this fact is key in realizing why the Evasion Optimus Prime mold was as well received as it was. Older fans were finally getting the alt mode they'd always wanted in the live-action aesthetic, and younger ones were excited for something fresh and new, as the last 3 films had remained pretty consistent. The actual end result, though, is kinda sad. I don't mean that in an insulting way, it's just that there's clearly metatextual bullshit going on here. Obviously, the color scheme deviates from the movie for marketability. It's unlikely that Hasbro would have been able to do the design justice in the rusty color scheme at the time. Maybe they could today with how well Studio Series is going, and supposedly we're getting another Evasion Optimus sometime in 2020 if the leaks are anything to go by. But yeah, back then, no dice. But taking a look at the actual on-screen model, it's clearly meant to be a rundown end-of-the-road Optimus Prime. This design is doing a lot more storytelling than the actual script itself.
Texas statute?
And when you combine that with a choice to go closer to the G1 design, you realize this is a not-so-subtle jab at G1ers. Ha ha, you fools! This is you! You're all pathetic old losers who aren't keeping up with the times! Maybe I'm presuming too much, but this seems to me to be incredibly obvious. As such, the design captures it perfectly in its sculpt work. From a nostalgic perspective, I get incredibly giddy when handling it again after all these years, but from an analytical one, yeah, this isn't doing it for me. The mechanical detail really seems at odds with the color scheme. It's one of the more vibrant Optimi, especially compared to the more recent outings, but it's designed deliberately to be the complete opposite. It seems like choices were made on the opposite sides of the equation and didn't quite gel together. Something like this fits more seamlessly with the rusty Takara version, donned with a pristine, covered in digital paint job. It's definitely not a bad alt mode by any means, but it's kind of underwhelming by modern standards. There are things to like though, even if you have to take them in a vacuum. The silver they used, for example, does look quite nice. Full disclosure, I was a bit haphazard when handling him and he's now got a big chip on the front, but overall it's done remarkably well. Granted, from experience, silver is a very easy color to do, and the vehicle mode pretty much only uses silver, which is pretty cheap in the long run. But it looks pretty nice. I also like how pronounced the surface detail is. It's definitely more toyetic than what we've got in the Studio Series line, in the sense that everything's far more exaggerated than you'd normally expect, and it gets a little bit fuzzy on the plastic elements as a result of the copying process, but in general, it successfully kept the design from being boring. I also really like the unconventional smokestack at the back. It really ties the rundown aesthetic together, even if the colors are doing everything in their power to avoid such. It's certainly a much better approach than the overcomplicated MO1 Commander anyway. And finally, I really like how angular it is. It's got a much sharper aesthetic in comparison to the more modern offerings, and I appreciate that quite a bit. There are issues, however, and they stem from 2 sources. the financial situation of the time and the fact that this is an unlicensed bootleg. To examine the former, let's take a look at the back. Not gonna lie, this is pretty bad. Not the absolute worst truck in the franchise, but it's still pretty lackluster. It's a massive mismatch of robot bits and half-sculpted vehicle details. This is the kind of stuff Bay haters use to try and justify their hate. Unfinished is the perfect word to describe it, especially since we've seen a more complete version executed on both Studio Series releases. That factor also applies to the windows, which basically looks like someone took a hammer to the windshield. Nothing here lines up, and given that the Weijang version shows that a few slight tweaks would have allowed them to, this is really disappointing. I suppose it could be perceived as continuing the torn down nature of the design, but in these colors it just looks half-baked. It's really disappointing that they put this much effort into making the wheels pins, yet they couldn't refine the mold properly. People complain that SS-38 took half a year after the Bumblebee movie to come out, but at least he was given ample time. But time wasn't the only reason this toy ended up underdone in such ways. Budget is also a key factor. As mentioned in the introduction, budgets were getting smaller and smaller with each year. It led to the splitting of the Prime line into First Edition and Robots in Disguise, as well as the castration of the Fall of Cybertron range. We'll never truly know the reason why. People have speculated it was due to rising oil prices, whilst others have hypothesized that it was due to corporate bigwigs wanting a bigger piece of the pie. Either way, you can tell the budget has been greatly reduced between films, so these flaws remain understandable, alongside his somewhat sapped stature. Still frustrating for long-time fans, but ultimately understandable, although at the time of purchase I had no point of reference as I was just getting back into the franchise. On the topic of the front though, this is made worse by the paint issues, which pertain to the fact that this is a knockoff as opposed to an original Hasbro Transformer. This was actually one of the premiere pieces from well-known company Bao, who coincidentally are the same guys behind Black Mamba and potentially even Transform Element. These guys would go on to make some truly remarkable bootlegs that would even break out beyond the Transformers community. As an early effort though, well, it's got its problems. For starters, much like the Weijang oversized knockoffs that I've previously covered, there are slight paint alterations, and in this case they are indeed inferiorities. The most prominent is easily the elbow sections, which haven't been fully painted at the top. This massively contributes to the unfinished look at the front, and had they altered this, the end result would have been far more justifiable in the sense of buying the knockoff over the original. The paint issues aren't limited to that though. One major addition to this version is the die cast added to the sides. Honestly, this causes way more trouble than it's worth. Aside from the transformation issues, which you'll see later on, the paint has a tendency to chip over time. Granted, this one at the front is completely my fault, but all of this nope. It's been in storage this whole time. That's happened on its own. Now granted, I don't have the original Hasbro release, and as such I can't confirm that one doesn't also have paint issues, but I can say this is a slight on Bao's part, and even at the decreased price, they should have been more careful. See, I can say that because in the years since we've seen them do way better. But that's not to say this knockoff doesn't have any pros of its own. One thing that absolutely takes the cake in comparison to the OG is the plastic quality. This thing is immensely dense and matches up pretty closely with the kinds of plastic we'd get these days, particularly on the Cyberverse toys. It's incredibly robust, which wouldn't normally be a thing of note, but this is Age of Extinction we're talking about. I don't own the original toy, but I have messed with it frequently, and the plastic quality ain't great, let me tell you. It's very close to what was seen in Fall of Cybertron. Cheap, thin, and a lot of fragile joints. This was the primary misstep on Hasbro's part, along with the lack of collector-oriented Movieverse lines prior to Studio Series, that created a canyon-wide opening for bootleg companies to take up residence in. All they had to do was deliver the bare minimum in terms of build quality, and collectors would eat that shit up. There's a reason the wait for the KO mentality exists, and persists to this day. I know what these people were like. For a time, I was that person. These days, though, Studio Series is much easier to hunt down, so I've had no need to go for the knockoffs. Ultimately, this vehicle mode ends up being a slight step above the original, but still sadly a product of its time. I wouldn't say it's aged like milk, but it's definitely got a sour taste these days. That said, there's a reason the vehicle mode is so compromised, so what do you say we move on? Given the complexity of the screen model, and the facts that Voyagers tend to have difficulty getting the chest to work at this size, the designers could have so easily had everything fold into the backpack, as they have many times before. Instead, it actually does something really interesting, almost folding inside out, with the faux chest to the back there folding around over the top. It's an incredibly rare transformation system, something that I haven't seen often. In fact, the only example I can think of recently was New Age Outback and Brawn. Apparently that's to be expected though, from the designer, who goes by the name Kobayashi Hironori. He's known for making the Revenge of the Fallen Legends Devastator, as well as allegedly MP44. I was chatting with people on my Discord and they were telling me about how he makes incredibly interesting and unique transformations, and this is definitely one of them. Do be warned though, there is a very specific order of operations with the chest. If you don't do it in order, the whole thing kinda gets stuck and bits clash into each other and it's just not fun. If you know what you're doing and you do it right, it's not that bad. First thing you want to do is fold down the smokestack and bring these two chest bits out, then open up this front section. With that out of the way, you can wiggle the top panel so that you can get the arms out like so. From here, untab these bits from the side, which will allow you to bring this whole section out on the double hinge. Interesting that these are actually two different lengths to account for the smokestack there. Very nice engineering touch. From here, you want to wiggle this panel all the way around with the head over there. We'll fix up the rest later, but that'll give you enough clearance for the arms to fold in and for this whole section to fold out, so they do clash a little bit, but overall it's not terrible. Keep this part out of the way and rotate the legs down like that. Take this section and fold it up. Line up that torso section in there. It doesn't really tab in, but it'll get locked in later. Take this section and fold it over the top. There are no tabs per se, but there is a slot and it lines up pretty well. Unfortunately, given the fact that this is a KO, these parts have been retooled and these parts have been shortened, so these don't lock in place, unfortunately. But there's plenty of locks anyway. So you keep these together and the chest locks everything in. The original was much more sturdy, but this isn't terrible either. One thing you don't want to forget to do is to bring these parts down. I often forget to do them when transforming it. Rotate the arms around into place if you haven't already. And this is actually pretty clever for the time. You want to separate the legs first so that it works better. Then what you want to do is grab this tab and untab it from there and rotate the entire leg section around like that into place. It might not seem that clever given that we've seen it quite often these days, but for the time it was remarkable, and these kinds of legs paved the way for the Studio Series version. So yes, once you get the order of operations down pat, it is an incredibly fun transformation. By today's standards it may not seem like anything remarkable, but for the time it was incredibly creative. In fact, I'd still argue that it's one of the more creative transformations these days as well. If they just redecorated it, it would fit pretty perfectly into the Studio Series line. We really are spoiled in many ways with mainline engineering these days, and this figure paved the way for that. In Robo Mode, things are looking way better. The scrappy aesthetic is much less pronounced, and as such, the resplendent colours fit in far better. What we end up with is basically a slightly G1ified version of Movie Prime with a boxier chest and a much more in-your-face overall aesthetic. In general, this works. I don't think the Robo Mode is as interesting as the transformation that got us here, but I dig it. One thing I really enjoy is the way the chest is executed. Getting the complete quadruple window design to work at a smaller scale has always been difficult over the years, and I think this design is one of the better attempts. Sure, Studio Series SS32/44 looks better in the end, but that had the benefit of both hindsight and a previous version. Looking back, it does infinitely better than any of the traditional mainline releases, and before you say, but the Battle Blades version, there's no way I'm counting that overcomplicated articulation gimped mess.
Oh yeah, I went there!
The chest provides a lot of layers that interplay with each other, and although it actually ends up being pretty hollow, you don't tend to notice it thanks to some pretty awesome contouring. I love how the two faux smokestacks pop up and provide not just some extra detail, but also some gap fillers for the neck area. And these shoulder spikes being made out of ladders? Genius! The legs may seem unremarkable, but for the time they were revolutionary. The clean nature absolutely blew any other similarly sized primes out of the water, and they certainly did a better job than the Knight design that was released at the same time. It's weird, technically it's pretty hollow with the side detail kinda just stopping. If you squint at it, yeah, it does look messy, but from most angles you flat out don't notice it. I don't know what they did to achieve such an effect, but I quite like it. I also love how the wheels flip out to the side to give Prime more outward kick range. Elements like these make it clear which mode was a priority. And sure, the calves look a little hollow from the back, but there were way more egregious examples at the time. It's fine, mate, it's fine. The arms, however, remain the most controversial element of the figure. Not to say this is a controversial release at all, mind you, but this is where most of the discussion related to. Well, aside from the size, but these days we're all used to smaller voiders, so who cares? I think they look pretty awesome sculpt-wise. The shoulders are just kinda there, not doing much, but the forearms incorporate some lovely detail. The sculpting at the front really brings this element to life, and I love how the window folds into the elbow. Unfortunately, said elbow is where things get annoying. You can't have the arms completely straight, as in at all. If you do, whoops! Looks like you just broke a bone or something. This kind of wouldn't fly today, and it's not just because arm kibble is becoming less and less common these days. Well, at least on the more mechanical guys, it's anything goes on the Oh, wait, I used that joke last week. Oh well. In the end, though, I don't mind. Firstly, who the hell displays their robot modes without any bend in the elbow? It just looks unnatural. Nobody stands like that. Unless maybe they're in a T-pose. And secondly, the range is ridiculously deep on this thing as a result. To me, it's such a minor thing that before going back and messing with this figure again, I'd completely forgotten about it. And sure, some people have complained about this panel here, at least enough for the Wayjang Commander to add an extra hinge to fix it. But on a Voyager-class Transformer, this sort of thing is to be expected. This ain't no masterpiece, it's fine. There are only a few more complaints I have, the first two being in relation to the head. As per usual, it's sculpted exceptionally. Aztec know how to do a Movieverse Prime head, so it's par for the course. But completely clear light piping? Really? The shape of the eyes is done pretty well, but you don't notice it thanks to this awful color choice. Really needed to be blue, which would have probably made the windows in truck mode look a lot better too. Also, they didn't use the best materials on the grey plastic for this KO. So over time, the ball joint has become loose. In fact, that's the primary difference between the KO and the original, aside from the lack of symbols on the die-cast metal. Whilst it's commendable that the plastic is nice and sturdy, as well as it not having many sprue marks, a common misstep on cheaper bootlegs, the joints are kinda wacky. One leg likes to pop off too easily, and the arm ratchets are incredibly inconsistent. To some, this may be a deal breaker, but to KO fans, this is familiar territory. None of this remains unfixable, and considering you're buying a Voyager for the price of a deluxe, I think it's a reasonable trade-off. Finally, the accessories are trash. Well, kinda. The gun he comes with is sculpted incredibly well, but this handle just doesn't work. Why doesn't it work, you may ask? Well, because it's not Prime's weapon at all. It's darker than Megatron's. It fits perfectly into his hand, as well as the 5mm port in vehicle mode, although it's pretty tight on the KO. That's rather neat, and I appreciate this callback, but why not make a gun that works properly with Prime? All they had to do was shorten the handle, and it would have been a done deal. They've already engineered a spring-loaded launcher, which I've sadly lost the missile for even before the production of the original review, so they had the budget to make this better. Doesn't even store properly in vehicle mode. All the ports suck Oreobot. The other accessory he comes with is, surprisingly, crumbs. Back in the day, this guy was purchased from a website known as Sir Toys, which commenters stupidly told me to keep on the down low as if Hasbro in their hubris would shut the thing down.
Nobody cares.
Since he's a knockoff of the G1 Micromaster Crumble, I nicknamed him Crumbs, and eventually he ended up becoming my mascot. As far as I can tell, the practice of including a random minifigure persists to this day, but who you get is entirely randomized. You're just as likely to end up getting Fraud Side as you are this color scheme, that is to say, extremely unlikely. Ultimately, this is a terribly built bot, but well, as I said last episode, shitty accessories and a good bot is infinitely better than getting a shitty bot with exceptional weapons. And in the end, this Prime is rather good. Again, by modern standards, he's a smidge underwhelming, mainly because engineering has progressed leaps and bounds in the last 3 years. But at the time, he was a stunning robot, and even by modern standards, there's a lot to like here. A lot of that's facilitated by his articulation. You might not bat an eye these days, but back then, all of these things were ridiculously rare. Yet again, the focus is mainly on the robot mode. It gets a lot of love and attention, and the posing power pushes that to the max. Although it's weird that the ankles rotate outwards further than they do inwards. Bit disappointing, but well. Still a pretty well designed bot, but that begs the question, should you buy this or should you buy the original? Well, I may not own the original, but I have messed with a mate's copy extensively. The original has better paint thanks to the lack of die-cast and the more fluid transformation, whereas the KO has better plastic and the inclusion of die-cast metal. Honestly, I think they're both on even footing. Just take this list, pick what you like, and go for that. The only external influence that might change one's opinion is the fact that it's potentially easier to find the official than it is the KO these days. And given the amount of KOs, it might be hard finding this particular one. But if you know what you're getting, yeah, I think it's worth it. I don't see this as just a figure in itself. I see it as a stepping stone for modern Transformers engineering. It's a stepping stone for collector-oriented Hashtag figures, paving the way for lines such as Studio Series. And it's also a stepping stone for one-to-one and even highly improved bootlegs, for better or for worse. I'm on the better side though. I don't KO shame. As a toy you can buy right now, whether official or unofficial, I'd hold off a bit and see if these leaks are true. For we might actually get a wholly better version, or it might be a repack of this, in which case it'll be easier to get anyway. If it is a new mold, there are plenty of things that can be improved. I mean, it's been 7 years for Christ's sake. But if those rumors fall through, I still don't think this is a bad figure to pick up, regardless of who ends up making it. I definitely wouldn't put this on your most wanted list, but if you're in the wild and you happen to come across one for cheap, well, you might as well have a gander.